The Eulengebirge, a region in former Lower Silesia. Here in the mountain ridges close to the Polish town of Glusha is hidden one of the most curious legacies of the Third Reich. Two amateur historians, a Pole and a German, made it their business to explore the peculiar subterranean facilities. Somewhere in the forest of the so-called Boozer's Heights, a mysterious chasm leads 48 meters deep into the earth. The experts believe it to be an unfinished elevator shaft. Jacek Duszak, a teacher in Poland, and Jürgen Müller of the association Berlin's Underworlds have been coming to this place for many years in order to find new evidence. Not least the gigantic timber-lined hall proves that the Nazis were planning great things here.
In
total, there are 7 underground tunnel systems. Only a very small part of them, maybe 1/8, was concreted. The rest are tunnels that are only partly supported with timber trunks and beams. Around 40,000 people were used as forced laborers in this entire area in the Eulengebirge. The temperature in the tunnels was about 8 degrees, and the laborers worked shifts of 10 or 12 hours a day. One can imagine that all this, along with a poor diet, caused many people to die.
Dann können Sie sich vorstellen, dass bei schlechter Ernährung, dass es da sehr viele Tote gab.
When the Soviets conquered Lower Silesia at the end of April 1945, they found the gigantic construction site abandoned. At first, they did not realize the sense or purpose of it.
Actually, these bunkers were always accessible after the end of the war. All the witnesses who were here after the Germans pulled out agreed that the place looked as if the workers had just left for their lunch break. The drill rods were still in the walls, spades lay around everywhere, tippers and dump trucks were filled with rubble. Everything appeared as if the workers were having a short break and would get back to work soon.
Concreted rooms for the guards and battlements for machine guns demonstrate the importance of the installation. Under strictest secrecy, a new headquarters for the Führer was being built here from November 1943. Codename Reza. Apparently, Hitler considered the Wolfschanze, his main field headquarters in East Prussia, no longer safe enough. For the building of a bomb-proof underground town for 20,000 people in the Eulengebirge, Armament Minister Speer granted 130 million Reichsmarks. An area of 40,000 square meters was to be ready for occupancy in August 1945. Many of the slave laborers used for the building of Reza were detailed from the Grossrossen concentration camp. In early 1945, the camp had some 75,000 inmates, while about 13,000, mostly Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz, were put up in outcamps in the Eulengebirge. Approximately half of them did not survive the labor for the safety of the dictator. The slave laborers had dug 3 kilometers of tunnels into the Wolfsberg, the largest complex among the systems planned in the Eulengebirge. Today, parts of the intricate tunnel system are underwater. The two explorers venture into the labyrinth cautiously. According to statements made by the site managers, about 55% of the planning stage was completed by November 1944. Excavations were to commence immediately. Exact assessments about the intended extent of the subterranean bunkers are not easy to make, as the original building plans for the Reza project disappeared after the end of the war. Jacek Duszak and Jürgen Müller are convinced that there are still many undiscovered underground installations in the Eulengebirge. According to the few remaining documents of the Nazis, plans also included the production of so-called Wunderwaffen in a gigantic subterranean factory. However, 60 years later, it's difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction.
We have information that all prisoners were evacuated at the end of the war, except for some who were ordered to camouflage the installations. Apparently, they disappeared without a trace, and so did their supervisors. Of course, this is all unconfirmed information. The Nazis had plenty of time to camouflage the tunnels. It is very difficult today to find the sealed portals because they were filled in skillfully. Now trees grow on the soil. They covered their tracks really well.
Fürstenstein Castle near Waldenburg was once the residence of the princes of Pless. In 1940, the spacious property of the relatives of Churchill was sequestered. 4 years later, some extensive renovation work began. Officially, the plan was to convert the Baroque jewel into a house for guests of the Nazi government. In reality, the castle was for Adolf Hitler and his minions. 35 architects from Speer's staff worked under strictest secrecy on a subterranean shelter system with direct access to the castle. In case of an emergency, an elevator would take the Führer from his chambers 50 meters deep into the mountain. The dictator and his closest entourage were supposed to have 3,200 square meters of floor space.
The basic idea, among other things, was that this was to become Hitler's last headquarters. Also, each of the leading personalities of the Third Reich would have their own subterranean shelter system. For example, there would be one for Goebbels, one for Himmler, and so on. Of course, the supreme commanders of the Wehrmacht, with Keitel and Jodl, would move in there too. For that reason, precise blueprints existed as to who was getting how many cubic meters.
Newsreel footage from the Wolfschanze near Rastenburg in the summer of 1944, as Hitler paid farewell to Benito Mussolini. The Führer's headquarters in East Prussia lay on an area of 250 hectares and was protected by 3 heavily guarded no-go zones. The railway tracks which the allies of the Third Reich used when visiting the headquarters are now overgrown. The former Wolfschanze is a field of rubble. Before they withdrew, the Germans blew up all the buildings, and the Red Army did the rest. Hitler's private shelter is a bulky lump. In 1944, all important structures in the innermost no-go zone were vaulted by massive reinforced concrete domes. Rokas Misch had not been to Rastenburg since the end of 1944. He was a member of the Führer's escort commando, so he was almost always at Hitler's side in the Wolfschanze. Returning here after 60 years is completely different from how the dictator's former bodyguard had imagined it. It's difficult now for him to recognize anything in the ruins.
It's a massive construction. Before, the residential shelters were 2, maybe 3 meters high at the most, and now it's so enormous. I'm amazed at what has become of it. I can still remember very clearly how everything used to look here, and all that had happened so fast, it's incredible.
Das ist in einem Rückzugverfahren passiert. Unglaublich, aber wahr. Wie schnell die das gemacht haben. In ein paar Wochen
Within a few weeks, the whole grounds here had changed. Just in a few weeks. Before, there were just some flat huts. If you came through there was a big room to the right with a long table where the briefings took place. It was quite cramped. It was not large. The massive structures were built afterwards.
Das war nicht groß. Das Gewaltige ist nahe entstanden.
When Hitler came from Berchtesgaden with his retinue to his new headquarters in East Prussia in mid-July 1944, his private bunker was not yet finished, so the dictator stayed at the visitors' shelter. Temporarily, the briefings took place in a nearby wooden cabin, and this was the case at noon on July the 20th, 1944. Hitler had asked his generals to present their reports. Some adjutants and servants were also in the room. Around 16 minutes to 1, the commander-in-chief bent over a big map table exactly here. At that moment, a bomb exploded. Colonel von Stauffenberg had placed it under the table. The explosion killed 4 and seriously injured 7. The cabin was almost completely destroyed. Hitler, protected from the heavy map table, suffered only minor injuries. The coup in Berlin failed on the same night. Still, the security measures after the assassination attempt were not tightened significantly.
Hat nie Angst gehabt.
He was never visibly scared. We never noticed that he was afraid in any way. When someone called his attention to it for whatever reason, he would always say, "I'll be fine, nothing will happen to me." Also, there weren't any changes as such, nothing at all. Everything was just as it was, as in the days before the attempt. The 20th of July happened, and in the following days, everything went on as usual. There was a reception for Mussolini, and then there were some other receptions, as if nothing had happened at all.
Only Hitler's closest aides knew the construction of a gigantic subterranean headquarters in Lower Silesia was in progress. He hoped that Reza would be ready soon. In there, he would be safe from enemy paratroopers and Allied bomber squadrons. At that time, Hitler spent very little time in Berlin. The Reich's capital was under attack by British and American bombers on an almost daily basis. In spite of the looming defeat, most Germans in 1944 still believed in and trusted their Führer. In order to boost the endurance of the population, air raid shelters have been constructed in all the major cities of Nazi Germany. What was probably the largest shelter has remained almost intact in Dortmund. The entrances are camouflaged, as the risk for uninvited guests would be far too great.
Here we have a typical characteristic feature of air raid shelters. These gas locks are always equipped with a door buffer. One could create an overpressure in the installation, so if there was a gas attack outside, one could prevent the gas from penetrating into the shelters.
After the first major Allied attacks on Dortmund, the public air raid shelters proved insufficient and offered only inadequate protection. As a result, excavations began for a gigantic tunnel system under the city.
Here in this area should be a cut for an opening to ground level. It was done from below, from the shelter to the surface. As you can see, the work was not finished. This here is the original rock as it was left after the blasting. It has just been lying like that for almost 60 years now.
When was the project abandoned?
Right at the end of the war. There'd been work going on in the bunker up until the end of the war. We have billing documents from April 1945 from which we can establish that people still worked here. You can also see that some tools were left behind too. The building site was abandoned just as it is today.
"80,000 people would have been able to get out of danger from the bombs in shelters up to 16 meters under the surface of the earth. 5 kilometers of the tunnel system were finished. It's said that after the end of the war, criminals would sometimes escape from the police into this underworld. They used the abandoned tunnel system as storage for stolen goods. The shelters were never used. Only few people in Dortmund today know that the bowels of their city are hollow. In the 1960s, a proposal to use the bunkers within the remit of the civil air defense was rejected. Today, the installations stand empty.
We're now coming into the area underneath Körnerplatz. Here we have a beautiful plan from 1943. You can see how the shelters would have looked if the planned work had been finished. This room here would have 2 stories then, lined with wood in order to keep out the humidity and make it a little bit warmer. It would all be divided up with corridors and individual cabins with fresh air and exhaust ducts, but obviously it never got to this stage. The end of the war caught up with the construction work. Now, let's move on.
There are no plans for public use of the shelters. The state authorities see to it that the galleries do not cave in.
Ein Querschnitt durch den Berliner Sonntag im 5. Kriegssommer.
Newsreel footage from Berlin. The Nazi propaganda tried to persuade the people that there was some kind of normality in their everyday life. Yet the truth could not be withheld completely.
Die Uniform beherrscht das Straßenbild. In dem durch Terrorangriffe mehrfach schwer heimgesuchten Berliner Zoo, der vor genau 100 Jahren eröffnet wurde. Freibad Wannsee hat von der alten Anziehungskraft nichts eingebüßt.
The idyllic atmosphere from the capital was deceptive. People were rarely safe. Allied bombs fell on Berlin almost daily. A subterranean air raid shelter testifies to the problems and the fears of the community. Almost every night, residents and travelers gathered here, as the installation had been integrated into a subway station. When the sirens wailed, people often had just a few minutes to reach the bomb-proof chambers. On February 3rd, 1945, 1,000 American bombers launched an all-out bombing raid on the Reich's capital. The first bomb struck the city center at 2 minutes past 11.
It suddenly became very, very quiet. One felt that something had hit the shelter, not because it was so loud, but because the noise was more like a thud. It was a very ominous moment and very frightening because one didn't really know whether the shelter would hold out. The bombs struck downstairs, where we would usually be, down at the entrances. Afterwards, we saw many dead bodies lying down there. It was only by chance that we were on the 3rd floor on that day, and so we survived the bombing.
Entire districts were in flames. Day turned into night from the smoke. A firestorm raged for hours.
When we finally came out, I think we must have been sitting in there for 2 or 3 hours. I couldn't recognize anything. The whole area looked so different that I asked myself how our mother would find her way to our home. The kiosk was gone, everything was in flames, the street was like a fire tunnel.
Many thousands died during this air raid on Berlin, the heaviest of the war. Hundreds of thousands became homeless. Little was left from the former glamour of the Third Reich. Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, was supposed to realize the Führer's sinister visions, but construction had long been suspended, and the few structures that had been completed were converted to accommodate the war effort. Somewhere in Berlin's zoo, the Tiergarten, can still be found the meticulously concealed entrance to a street tunnel of Hitler's world capital, Germania. Nobody has been in there for years. Dietmar Arnold from the association Berlin's Underworlds ventures in. It's a risky undertaking, as poisonous gases may have formed underground.
We're now almost 9 meters under the Tiergarten in the western tunnel of the main junction. It was planned to be an expressway or motorway tunnel, 90 meters long, 14 meters wide, 4.8 meters high. These are remains of Germania. The junction was to be the intersection of the planned east-west and north-south connections. Large parts of the east-west connection were indeed built, which today are the Straße des 17. Juni and Unter den Linden. But the north-south connection was never built. This is what remains of those ambitious plans. This tunnel was only rediscovered in 1967. The roof has been renovated, as you can see here. They worked out that it was cheaper to preserve the building than to fill it in.
Cars have never driven through this tunnel. At some point during the war, a partition wall must have been built. Armament plants would have continued their production here in a bomb-proof environment. The only reminder of it today is a rusty lamp. At the far end of the tunnel, Dietmar Arnold has found proof that the tunnel was also used by Berlin's population as an air raid shelter during the bomb attacks.
This is the access stairway through which people would come down. I think it's really interesting how worn down these stairs are. There must have been masses of people who used these narrow steps to enter this tunnel. And this here may have been an emergency door to the shelter.
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels was concerned that the unrelenting airstrikes could shake morale on the home front. His staff secretly filmed these scenes from Berlin on his behalf. The population never got to see such footage. By that time, the Nazi leadership appeared only rarely in public. Goebbels visited the ruins of St. Hedwig's Cathedral, demonstrating his determination for the newsreel. The minister had a private bunker under his official villa in the center of the government district. The rest of the installations were discovered accidentally during some construction work in 1998. Little is known about the interior furnishings of the shelters. Goebbels' diaries indicate that he and his family used the shelter often. Apparently, the chambers were not luxuriously furnished. Nevertheless, the propaganda minister was able to maintain constant contact with the outside world by means of modern telephone fittings. Despite vigorous conservationist protests, the rest of the underground installations were filled in soon after their discovery. A private film of the Goebbels family from 1943 shows how things may have looked down there.
So. Aufstehen! Aufstehen! Helgerchen, komm her. Schnell ran. Holly, steh schon auf. Zieh dich schon an. Ich muss doch losgehen. Ja, schon, Mensch.
Magda Goebbels was one of the most ardent supporters of Hitler from the early days. When the downfall of the Nazi Empire became inevitable, she did not hesitate for 1 second. She and her family committed suicide in the Führer's bunker. At the end of April 1945, the dictator barricaded himself in the bunker under the Chancellery in Berlin and waited for a miracle. Raucous Misch accompanied his Führer through this final act.
Hitler's death dragged on from the 22nd to the 30th of April. It was postponed from one day to the next. Actually, Hitler wanted to put an end to it on the 22nd, after he had dismissed everyone. I will stay here, he said. I'm not leaving Berlin. But everyone else should go and leave him behind. He was ready to take his own life. But then the radio operator picked up a communication of the Western Allies that said the Germans absolutely must continue to defend Berlin for another 2 or 3 weeks. When Hitler was informed, he said they should have thought of it earlier. The war is lost now.
Das hat man Hitler mitgeteilt und da hat Hitler gesagt, das hätte sich früher überlegen sollen, der Krieg ist doch verloren.
On the afternoon of April the 30th, the dictator and his newly wedded wife, Eva Braun, retired to their underground chambers to commit suicide.
Es war Kirchenstille, Mäuschenstille.
It was as silent as a church. You couldn't hear a sound. Everyone was whispering. Then someone shouted, Linger, Linger. Linger was Hitler's manservant. I think it's done. Then the door opened and I looked in, of course. Then the next person went in and another door was opened, and then I saw Hitler slumped by the couch. Or maybe he had collapsed on the armchair next to it. I'm not 100% certain anymore. I also saw Eva lying there with her knees tucked up.
On the following day, the Red Army stormed into the center of Berlin. On May the 1st, 1945, in the bunker of the Chancellery, Joseph Goebbels held the position with a few loyal followers. When we make our exit, the world shall tremble, the propaganda minister had written in his diary 2 weeks previously. The victors of Berlin inspected the ruins of Hitler's center of power. The world that will come after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in. Magda Goebbels used these words to justify her taking the lives of her children before she committed suicide with her husband. The victors found their bodies in the garden of the Chancellery of the Reich.
At Merkers, Germany, this salt mine holds one of the strangest secrets of the war. a secret that was to deal Germany a crushing financial blow during the last days of the conflict. Here, GIs uncovered a fabulous hoard of jewelry, silver, currency, bullion, and art treasures. Much of it the accumulated loot of 5 years of war. Practically every museum in Europe is represented in these masterpieces, which include Raphael's, Rembrandt's, Van Dyck's, and many other great masters' works, buried now 1,200 feet below the ground in what the Nazis considered a safe hiding place and a bomb-proof shelter.
The tunnels of the former potassium mines in Kaiserode crisscross large areas of southern Thuringia. Over the course of decades, miners have dug hundreds of kilometers on several levels through the saline soil. The complex system of tunnels resembles a maze. If something was to be hidden here, chances are it would not be found. After the demise of East Germany, hardly any salt has been mined around the village of Merkers. The mine owners are hoping for greater profits from tourism. The history of the incredible discovery of the treasure in 1945 is supposed to fire the visitor's imagination. Maybe something could still be hidden here. The story of the spectacular deposits has been accurately reconstructed.
In February and March 1945, this stretch of tunnel we are covering now was used as storage for the gold and monetary reserves of Nazi Germany. After the devastating air raid on Berlin, according to the records, Walter Funk, the president of the Reichsbank at the time, decided to move the gold reserves to a safe place. The location they chose was the mine Kaiserode 23, the modern-day Merkers. By the beginning of March, the reserves had been transported by freight trains and stored here. Most of the workers in the mine were foreign displaced persons. Only the security personnel and the overseers were German. It must have been common knowledge among the foreign workers and prisoners of war who worked in the mine that the gold of the Nazis was stored here. For this reason, when the Americans took Merkers on April the 4th, it didn't take long before they tracked down the treasure and came into this chamber we're in now.
American financial and art experts immediately began to examine the treasure. It was quickly established that the hoard constituted the gold and monetary reserves of the Third Reich, as well as the art collections of Berlin's museums. Few stolen cultural assets were found here. At a later point, the Allies found many of the art treasures the Nazis had looted from all over Europe in some other mines in the south of Germany and Austria. Some valuable items are still missing today. Little by little, the Allied armies occupied all of Nazi Germany. On April the 22nd, 1945, American and French army units took Stuttgart. The remaining German troops did not defend the city and capitulated to the Allied supremacy. A bunker that testifies to the final combat for Stuttgart has been preserved deep inside the Killersberg. It appears that the Wehrmacht leaders in Stuttgart coordinated their pointless mission from this command post. Communication officers received commands that never reached most of the soldiers above. The rooms seem untouched, as if the war ended only yesterday. The safe appears to have been opened by force. The remains of a gas mask lie on the floor. The door to the police office is riddled with bullet holes. Did a last exchange of fire with the henchmen of the regime take place here? Did someone sacrifice his life for his Führer, although everything was already lost? For a long time, the Allies were concerned that Hitler, together with his last loyal supporters, would barricade himself at Obersalzberg, where the Nazi leadership had kept a hermetically sealed safe haven since the 1930s. During the war, the Führer and his retinue had often come to Berchtesgaden, and whenever Hitler stayed up here, he was always heavily guarded by security forces and SS troopers. Descent into the underworld of the Nazi mountain. A team of surveyors systematically explores and measures the subterranean shelters. Directly from the Obersalzberg Records Office, a shaft leads 30 meters down into the earth. Nobody knows exactly what is hidden down there. The wooden staircase collapsed decades ago. The surveyor team and their equipment are cautiously lowered with an elaborately secured motorized rope elevator. At the bottom of the shaft, the experts expect to find the entrance to a half-finished SS shelter. They find 350 meters of largely unsupported tunnels. Only the first caverns have been lined with bricks, and the cable shafts concreted in parts. The advance ends 60 meters deep in the rock. Florian Bayerl is one of the most knowledgeable experts as far as Obersalzberg is concerned. He's been investigating its history since his youth and has also interviewed many witnesses of the time. Bayerl knows that the interior of the Brown Mountain looks like a burrow. The system of tunnels and bunkers is almost 6 kilometers long, and apparently even bigger installations were planned. Here, people worked 3 shifts a day until just before the end of the war. The drills of the miners were resharpened around the clock in order to keep up the pace. The workforce was so large that people often stood in each other's way. Moreover, those who wanted to shirk the Sunday shift risked a confrontation with the site manager and the security troops.
This is actually the last unexplored and unregistered section of the Obersalzberg bunkers. It's an SS shelter that was laid out at an enormous depth, far under the existing tunnels. Due to this long shaft, which was built under here, it was not accessible. But now digital surveying technology has enabled us for the first time to form a precise and complete picture of all the subterranean installations under the Obersalzberg. When you study the records of the Obersalzberg Council regarding the tunnel structures and fuse them with the testimonies of witnesses of that time, you come to the conclusion that this whole tunneled area was intended to be protection shelters for approximately 400 SS troopers. At the same time, however, these gigantic halls that we discovered here today were designed to be large ammunition depots for the defense of what we presume was an Alpine fortress.
Also, the readings show that the shelter structures of Hitler's Berghof begin no more than 10 meters away. Was the SS also supposed to be deployed underground for the Führer's defense?
A total of 3,000 laborers worked in the tunnels of Obersalzberg. When you look at this section here, you can see different stages of development, from the unlined crumbly rock that is still predominant here to the semi-finished final stage of construction, as we can see around us here, with the drain tiles. With the same workforce numbers, one would certainly need to work another 4 to 5 months in order to finish this tunnel system and be able to use it as an air raid shelter.
It was Hitler's notorious secretary, Martin Bormann, who directed the construction of the subterranean air raid shelter installations at Obersalzberg. Bormann had a spacious bunker constructed for his large family too. Today, it may be entered only with a special permit. "77 steps led directly from Bormann's house down into the underworld. An almost 60-meter-long corridor led into the private chambers. Sheltered machine gun posts were built in for protection against enemy intruders.
The entire Obersalzberg shelter complex was completely autonomous as far as supplies were concerned. An independent water supply was available, there was a poison gas-proof ventilating system, and a store of food supplies. It would have been possible to hold out here for a long period of time. The only problem would have been that they could not guard the entrances for the outside, but only from within. There were no fortifications on the outside, which means that the enemy, during a siege, could penetrate into the shelters up to the machine gun posts and would have to be fought off from there. This is the section of the Bormanns. 3 different chambers, all ventilated with bunk beds, probably for the children. What is interesting is that one consciously used a relatively warm paint color here in order to make the surroundings a little jollier.
Hier bewusst eine relativ warme Farbe verwendet worden ist, dieses Dasein unter Tage nicht ganz so öde zu gestalten.
The light switches for the children were also positioned about 50 centimeters lower than elsewhere.
Ist man 50 Zentimeter fast tiefer gegangen wie sonst wo. Es gab Holzböden.
The floors were wooden. You can imagine the bunk beds standing here. As you can see, they even had pictures hanging on the walls. The nails are still there. The Bormanns stayed here in this shelter for weeks, not only here underground, but in the house too, of course. The danger from enemy bombers was quite extreme at the end of 1943, so the Bormanns had made themselves a home here.
Und die Familie Bormann hat sich also richtig eingerichtet hier unten.
Bormann's safe was removed by the Americans at the end of the war. The outline is still recognizable. A communications control room equipped with state-of-the-art devices received the latest radio messages and announcements from the front. But Bormann also had a small underground town laid out for Hitler and Eva Braun. The entire entourage of the dictator would have been able to get out of danger from the Allied bomb attacks under the Berghof. At the beginning of April 1945, supplies were unloaded and stored in the shelters. Even Allied intelligence assumed that the dictator was already at Obersalzberg.
The false security of Berchtesgaden, from where so much of the world's tragedy was planned and directed, was shattered in April by a force of Allied heavy bombers. Arriving at daybreak, they attacked Hitler's notorious mountain hideout and the chalet in the valley below with 12,000-pound bombs fused for deep penetration. The SS barracks nearby also received accurate attention.
bombs destroyed most of the buildings. The Berghof became uninhabitable. The sorry remains of Hitler's royal retinue survived in the bunkers. Then came the Americans. US Commander General Omar Bradley went to visit Obersalzberg. The demolished Berghof became a sightseeing attraction for the victors. The mysterious bunkers also aroused the interest of the US soldiers. The camera crew of the US Army captured a GI entering the Führer's bunker with curiosity. In the 1,800 square meters of shelters, Hitler and his last followers could have held out for weeks.
Up until the last day, the people at Obersalzberg expected that Hitler would come. Everything was prepared, the shelters were all furnished and ready as far as possible, and the vanguard from the Chancellery of the Reich in Berlin was already there. Therefore, one can say that if Hitler had come here, the war might have lasted a bit longer. From here, he would have been able, at least logistically, to control and direct whatever was left of his Reich at that time.
Den Trümmerhaufen, der noch übrig war zu dem Zeitpunkt, weiter zu lenken und leiten.
When the radio reported Hitler's death on May 1st, 1945, the security staff at Obersalzberg began to loot the remaining possessions of their Führer. With the permission of the Americans, Berchtesgaden citizens later also helped themselves to the hoarded supplies. Hitler's private archives had been set on fire by one of his adjutants before the Americans found them. The library that was still in the bunker, as well as his music collection and paintings, were confiscated by the Americans. It appears that unauthorized people gained access to Eva Braun's bedroom after the end of the war and staged wild parties. The cavern had been completed and was ready for occupancy by April 1945. Her large wardrobe and her china were already in there. Upon the express wishes of the Führer's lover, a bathroom with a tub had been installed especially for her. Today, there's not much left to see. The chambers stand empty, and yet illicit treasure hunters often break in and search through the puzzling maze of bunkers. The Führer's cavern was right next to Eva Braun's. Apparently, the furnishings were Spartan. The Americans cleared away all the furniture and fittings, and the rest fell into the hands of tourists and souvenir hunters. Even the tiles were stripped from the bathroom. Hitler himself had been down here only once. He decided to meet his downfall in Berlin.